All right, the senator is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share the very serious concerns that have been raised in this committee about this nominee. This nominee, I believe, has a record that does not reflect a fair and impartial temperament, does not reflect a commitment to the even-handed administration of justice, but rather she has a record and a lifetime as an extreme partisan and as a zealot. And I do not believe that she has treated this committee with the candor that we should expect from all nominees. Just a couple days ago, every Republican senator on this committee sent a letter to the chairman asking the chairman to schedule a second hearing for this nominee. That's not a letter we send on many nominees. That is an unusual step, and every single Republican signed that letter. Why did we sign that letter? Because her statements before this committee were in direct contradiction to her long-standing record. And indeed, we urge the committee to follow the standard that Ms. Gupta urged concerning Republican nominees. In 2017, Ms. Gupta said, and I quote, "Chairman Grassley must put the politics aside and bring both nominees before the committee so they can be asked about their truthfulness under oath. Failure to do so would abdicate the independent role of the Senate. If the Senate Judiciary Committee is going to be taken seriously by this and future administrations, it must demand that nominees accurately respond to questions." That's what she insisted at the time. Now, when it is her answers that are not accurately responding to questions, that same standard is not supposed to apply to her. The letter that we sent the chairman outlined 4 different areas where her answers were materially misleading and dishonest. The first concerned her support for eliminating qualified immunity. During the hearing, Ms. Gupta was asked whether she supports eliminating the doctrine of qualified immunity. And she responded that she doesn't support elimination one way or another. Now, let me be clear. Whether or not qualified immunity should be eliminated is an issue on which reasonable minds can differ. There is debate on this committee and elsewhere about whether changes should be enacted in the doctrine of qualified immunity. My criticism with her on this is that she wasn't honest or candid with this committee when asked about this question. She told this committee she doesn't support elimination one way or the other, but in June 2020, and I would note this is not some ancient history, this is June of 2020, this is last year, she testified before the committee, quote, "Congress should end qualified immunity in Section 1983 claims." Now, when you have testified before this committee that Congress should end qualified immunity, you cannot credibly come before this community and say you don't have a position one way or the other. Those are in direct contradiction. Now, when she was pressed about her June 2020 testimony before the committee, Ms. Gupta claimed remarkably that her testimony was not her own opinion, that she was merely, quote, representing the consensus view of the Civil Rights Coalition at the leadership conference. Now, of course, she led the leadership conference, and she testified here, and in fact, during the June 2020 hearing, one of the other witnesses said that he believed qualified immunity should be eliminated, and Ms. Gupta added, quote, "I agree." Not the organization that has asked me to testify agrees, but I agree. That is directly contrary to her testimony to this committee. How about decriminalization? She was asked before this committee whether she advocates for decriminalization of all drugs. Ms. Gupta answered unequivocally, "No, Senator, I do not." And then she doubled down on that misleading statement. She doubled down in writing. When asked in writing about her position, here's what she said in writing to this committee. She said that she had, quote, never advocated for the decriminalization of all drugs. Now, there are some careful lawyers on this committee. There are lawyers who know how to speak precisely. If a nominee represents to this committee that they have never advocated for the decriminalization of all drugs, one would expect it to be the case that they had never advocated. It's not, I'm not currently advocating, not today, not this morning, not at this moment. Never means never. So was she telling the truth? Well, on September 4th, 2012, she authored an op-ed. I noted the chairman said earlier, gosh, on the question of drugs, some people have changed their minds. And, you know, some of us may have said some comment sometime in the past. Well, perhaps we're not discussing whether she sat around the breakfast table one morning chatting with her family and expressed a view. This is an op-ed by Vanita Gupta. So she authored an op-ed. She sat down to write it. The title of the op-ed is, "It's Time to Discuss Criminal Justice Reform." The picture on the op-ed, I would note, is of a woman smoking a joint. This was not subtle. That's the picture of her op-ed. There's Vanita Gupta, her name. Her op-ed is a woman smoking a joint in front of what appears to be a state capitol. I don't know where this photograph was taken. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that this op-ed be entered into the record.
Without objection.
In this op-ed, let's read what she said. She said, and I quote, "Decriminalize/defelonize drug possession. States should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs, particularly marijuana, and for small amounts of other drugs." Now, Mr. Chairman, as talented as the lawyers are on this committee, I challenge any Democratic senator to explain to me, under the most tortured interpretation of the language, how these two statements are remotely consistent. In writing in an op-ed that she signed under her name, she said, states should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs. All. She uses the word all. That doesn't just mean marijuana. Reasonable people can disagree on the question of whether marijuana should be decriminalized or not. That's one reason why I believe that's an issue that should be left to the states, because different voters in different states can come to different determinations on that question. But she didn't say marijuana. She said states should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs. All drugs includes heroin. All drugs includes cocaine. All drugs includes methamphetamines. All drugs includes fentanyl. We are in the midst of an opioid crisis in this country that has taken far too many lives, and the statement that states should, and it isn't consider. She didn't say states should debate, states should think about, states should study. It was states should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs. Now let's go back to what she told this committee in writing, where she said she had, quote, never advocated for the decriminalization of all drugs. That is a flat-out falsehood, and there's no way to read the language otherwise. Third, her support for defunding the police. During the hearing, Ms. Gupta repeatedly stated she did not support defunding the police. The chairman spent quite a bit of time trying to rehabilitate the witness, trying to back her away from defunding the police. But those statements directly contradict her sworn testimony before this committee when on June 16th, 2020, so not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, last year, under oath before this committee, where she said that leaders must, quote, heed calls to decrease police budgets and the scope, role, and responsibility of police in our lives. That was her testimony last year. When she was pressed by a member of this committee that she had advocated for defunding the police, she said she disagreed with that characterization. But it's striking, just 2 days after her June 2020 testimony, she participated in a webinar in which Ms. Gupta said the following, quote, localities have been overspending on criminal justice system infrastructure and policing and divesting in housing, education, jobs, and health care. Some people call that defunding the police. Other people call it divest, invest. So Ms. Gupta understood fully well that what she was advocating for, in her own words, some people call that defunding the police. She wasn't confused about it. She knew what she was advocating for. And strikingly, and Senator Lee made this same point, the Washington Post, which reliably supports Democrats on just about everything, the Washington Post, her flip-flop, her contradiction on defunding the police was so stark that the Washington Post correctly noted that Ms. Gupta's June 2020 statement was, quote, exactly what defunding the police is all about. Now Gupta says she has never supported the idea. So the Washington Post, assessing it with their political bias in favor of this administration, even the Post was forced to admit her comments were directly contrary to her testimony. And by the way, her written testimony in June of 2020 before this committee, she said the following: Congress must also re-examine federal spending priorities and shrink the footprint of the police and criminal legal system in this country. This means shifting billions of federal taxpayer dollars away from criminalization, including policing, towards rebuilding communities of color.
Sorry to interrupt you, Senator. Can you tell us when you might conclude your remarks?
I'm probably going to continue another 5-10 minutes.
Thank you.
You know, numerous Democratic members of the Senate realized in the last election cycle that the angry rhetoric of the extreme left in their party was problematic politically, and that defunding the police, even if they supported it, was really dangerous politically, because most people understand that defunding the police is a spectacularly foolish option. And I would note that's not just the view of Republicans, that's the view of independents, that's the view of Democrats. And that's not just the view of Anglos, that is also the view of African Americans, and it's the view of Hispanics. And indeed, it is communities of color, when you defund the police, who are most often the victims of violent crime. Defunding the police is a radical position. And more than a few Senate Democrats have realized their party's embrace of that position was a political liability, so you've seen Senate Democrats backing away, saying, never mind, no, we don't support defunding the police anymore. Well, this committee is going to have an opportunity to go on record, because any senator who votes to confirm Vanita Gupta is a senator who is voting in favor of defunding the police. This has been her long-standing position she has advocated for, so no senator should be surprised when your constituents say, why did you vote for someone who says, and again I'm going to quote, Congress must re-examine federal spending priorities and shrink the footprint of police. If you want to stop violent crime, shrinking the footprint of police is a very bad idea. And the criminal legal system in this country, that means shifting billions of federal taxpayer dollars away from criminalization, including policing. So every member of this committee should be on notice. You vote for this nominee, you are voting for shifting billions of dollars away from policing. That will hurt communities of color. That will hurt low-income communities. That will hurt victims that are plagued by gang violence, by drug dealers who rely on the police to protect themselves from homicide, from physical assault, from sexual assault. That is an extreme position, and her position before this committee was not honest and was not candid. The fourth ground on which every Republican senator asked for a second hearing was her position on the death penalty. And on the death penalty, she was asked about her long-standing opposition to the death penalty. And I would note, Ms. Gupta has not been nominated to be in charge of the Housing and Urban Development Department. She's been nominated to be the number 3 official at the U.S. Department of Justice. Whether or not she agrees with the death penalty is federal law passed by this Congress and in the United States Code. And having a senior official who has a passionate opposition to the death penalty raises serious question about whether the Department of Justice will fairly and impartially administer the laws. So how did she handle that before this committee? Well, when she was asked about it and her long-standing, passionate opposition to the death penalty, here's what she said. I also know how to enforce the law. And I did so when I was in the Justice Department before. When Dylann Roof committed the heinous act against 9 parishioners at the Charleston Church, and that prosecution and conviction happened under my watch. So that's what she told the committee. And, I got to say, that's a comforting response. The shooter at the Mother Emanuel Church who committed a heinous, bigoted hate crime is a textbook example of someone who should be subject to the death penalty. And she brought it up, and she said, in effect to this committee, judge my ability to follow the law by how I handled the Dylann Roof case. That testimony on its face seems very good, except there's a problem. She wasn't being honest. She wasn't being straightforward with this committee. She was misleading, and she was misleading by omission. So what she said was, that prosecution and conviction happened under my watch. Well, as Paul Harvey used to say, what's the rest of the story? The rest of the story, the Democratic members of this committee know well, is the Washington Post, again, the Washington Post in 2016, noted that Attorney General Loretta Lynch approved prosecutors seeking the death penalty for Dylann Roof, quote, over the objections of some advising her, including Vanita Gupta. So when this committee asked her about it, she said, well, look at that case. That shows I could apply the death penalty. And what did she not mention? That she argued against the death penalty. She said, yes, he committed a racially bigoted, horrific mass gun shooting, but nonetheless, she advocated don't seek the death penalty because her own ideological views prevented her from enforcing the law and following federal law. And she knew that. And so before this committee, she didn't tell this committee that she had advocated against seeking the death penalty. She didn't admit that. Instead, she tried to claim credit. I want to go back to what she said here. And that prosecution and conviction happened under my watch. Without saying she opposed it, that is affirmatively misleading. And I would note also that when she was asked about these contradictions in written questions, Ms. Gupta found a brand new way of dodging the question. She said it, quote, would not be appropriate to discuss what she did at the Department of Justice. Well, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I want you to think about a nominee for the number 3 position at the Department of Justice saying it's not appropriate to talk about what she did the last time she was at the Department of Justice. I'm going to suggest to you it is entirely appropriate to talk about what she did last time at the Department of Justice, and the reason she doesn't want it to be appropriate is because she can't defend what she did at the Department of Justice and because she misled this committee about what she did at the Department of Justice. That is a lack of candor. I would note beyond that, part of the reason she thinks it's inappropriate to discuss her time at the Department of Justice is because her time at the Department of Justice was more that of a partisan zealot than of a fair-minded enforcer of the law. The state of Louisiana enacted a school choice program, a program to give hope to low-income kids, a program to give scholarships and opportunity to low-income kids, many of whom are African American, many of whom are Hispanic, who need hope and opportunity. I believe school choice is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. Well, you know what? Ms. Gupta does not.
Senator, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but I just wanted to, do you have an indication as to when you might finish?
Probably another 5 minutes or so.
Another 5. Thank you.
Ms. Gupta does not. And we know that she does not because she was leading the Civil Rights Division. Now, the state of Louisiana is trying to give scholarships for low-income kids, many of whom are black, many of whom are Hispanic. You would think the Civil Rights Division would be cheering this. Yes, these kids need hope, options, a chance at a good education, a chance at the American dream. This is the mission of the Civil Rights Division. Well, not Ms. Gupta's partisan view. What happened? The Department of Justice intervenes not in support of the African American kids, not in support of education, not in support of civil rights. The Civil Rights Division intervened opposing the civil rights of those African American kids, arguing the school choice program must be struck down. And I will tell you, a circuit judge wrote that the Department of Justice had attempted to shoehorn, that was the word of the circuit judge, had attempted to shoehorn its regulation in an unrelated case. In other words, that this was a partisan political agenda, and she was willing to use the enforcement arm of the Department of Justice to target and go after and oppose the civil rights of young African American children in the state of Louisiana. That is not fair-minded, that is not impartial, that is a partisan zealot. When Senator Tim Scott introduced comprehensive policing reforms designed to protect civil rights, Ms. Gupta, who says she supports civil rights, one would expect, would celebrate that effort. Instead, she denigrated Senator Scott as, quote, playing politics. Senator Scott is an African-American senator representing the state of South Carolina. It's not the first time people on the hard ideological left have denigrated his service, have taken the view that a black man cannot have a view contrary to the hard left-wing orthodoxy. As an advocate, as a zealot, those views are ugly, but they're not out of step with partisan advocates. They are out of step with what we should expect at the U.S. Department of Justice. We should expect fairness. 2 other points I want to make in conclusion. On the question of religious discrimination, Civil Rights Division, she was at previously, is charged with protecting civil rights. That includes the civil rights of people of faith. That includes the civil rights of people to live according to her faith. But her record doesn't demonstrate a commitment to protecting those civil rights. Instead, it demonstrates an animus to those civil rights. So when the Obama Justice Department was litigating against the Little Sisters of the Poor, Catholic nuns who've taken vows of poverty, who spend their time caring for the poor and the needy, Ms. Gupta was vocal in supporting that litigation, persecuting those nuns, attacking them for exercising their religious liberty. Finally, on the question of big tech censorship, one of the greatest threats to free speech in this country today, perhaps the greatest threat to free speech, is the growing power of the Silicon Valley oligarchs, of billionaires with monopoly control, brazenly censoring the speech of those with whom they disagree, silencing conservatives, silencing their political opponents, sometimes with the encouragement of members of the United States Senate, abusing that power to stifle free speech. Well, Ms. Gupta styles herself as a defender of civil rights, so I would assume she would be rising up for the civil rights of those who are being censored and silenced. But sadly, that assumption would not be correct. Indeed, Ms. Gupta in 2019, and we're not talking again 10, 20 years ago, we're talking 2019, Ms. Gupta lambasted Facebook for a new policy that exempted politicians' speech. She said simply allowing people to hear what elected officials say, that was enabling authoritarian politicians. Now, let's be clear what she's saying. She's saying, big tech, make sure the American people can't hear anyone on this side of the aisle. Make sure the only thing the American people can hear are the left-wing views she supports, and silence anyone else. She attended a dinner of 9 people with Mark Zuckerberg to discuss the matter. And she later wrote that, quote, Facebook fails to appreciate the harmful impact of disinformation on elections and the proliferation of hate speech and violence, particularly for communities of color. Now, the Department of Justice has ongoing litigation against big tech. Monumentally important litigation. I'll tell you, as I go home to Texas and I hear from Texans, I hear concern over and over and over again, can you trust the Biden administration to go after big tech? Even though big tech are among the biggest donors to Democrats. They give millions and millions of dollars to the Biden campaign and to Senate Democrats. Can we trust them to be fair and apply the law concerning big tech? And I have to say, with Ms. Gupta's record, there's no reason to believe she could be fair or impartial. She has been a cheerleader for big tech. And to the extent she's criticized big tech, it has been, you're not censoring enough. Abuse your monopoly power even more and silence everyone who disagrees. That's dangerous. That does not give any members of the public confidence in the fairness or impartiality of the Department of Justice. You know, this committee heard Merrick Garland testify. And Merrick Garland testified that he'd be fair and impartial and apply the law. And many Republicans were initially encouraged by Judge Garland's nomination, because as a judge, he had built a record not as a partisan zealot. His answers to this committee were less than fully forthcoming, and I think undermined some of that reputation he had built over the decades. But I will tell you, the fact that a nominee for the number 3 position has this record as a partisan zealot raises serious questions about whether this Department of Justice will be able to fairly apply the law. Every Republican senator asked the chairman to hold a new hearing, and Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that that letter be entered into the record as well.
Without objection, is the senator concluding?
I am concluding now. Every Republican senator asked for an additional hearing because of her outright falsehoods and contradictions before this committee. Unfortunately, the Democratic chairman declined that request and instead wants to try to force this nomination through. I think that's a mistake. This might well head through to a party line vote, but I think we should expect something significantly more of senior leadership at the U.S. Department of Justice.